Okay, this is more formal proof practice for FOL, and this video goes with one of two that you just saw previously. In that formal proof, we had the exact same conclusion for all x p of x, and the only difference was that the premise then was a disjunction inside this existential. Here, this is the Boolean definition, or this is the arrow version of the Boolean equivalence that we just saw. So this is an arrow replacing that negation and disjunction pattern. So what I want you to do is try to figure out how to do this proof, and then you'll see ways in which this is similar and somehow different from the previous proof. So what difference does this little arrow make being buried inside the scope of here? When does that difference become apparent versus when does the similarities between these two proofs dictate that the solutions are going to be almost the same? Now, you might have thought one thing. I told you when we were doing translations, never do it, write an arrow inside the scope of an existential. That's incredibly ugly from a logical aesthetic point of view to me. But don't worry about that. That rule holds for when you're doing translations. From a logical point of view, this still makes sense, and we can understand from a formal proof perspective how this works. Another point, if you push this negation and past this existential, you'll see that this is actually a universal quantifier out front anyway when you put this in pre-next normal form. So it isn't even the ugly abhorrent form that I don't like. But don't worry about the structure of the thing. Just worry about proving this. So pause your videos now to see if you can figure out how to do this proof. Okay, let's talk about the solution. This is a negation around an existential. It is that annoying pattern, but by now you've had a little bit of practice, and hopefully that won't be so intimidating to you. Hopefully what you did is you looked at the conclusion and you saw, since this is a universal quantifier, you love proving universal quantifiers. You know what to do. So structurally speaking, compare this to the previous proof we did. The conclusion is the same. So these steps that we're doing at the outset are going to be identical because the difference between those premises is not making any apparent difference yet. So I assume the same thing on line 3. Why is that the same as what we did previously? Because I need the same thing on the second to last line of this proof to finish that universal intro proof. None of the differences between the premises impact any of this yet. Now, on line 4, all of a sudden, this is different than what we did before. So now, why are we suddenly doing something differently on line 4, which you didn't do in the previous proof? Here's how you could have figured this out. Remember the contradiction symbol. When I assumed not P of n on line 3, I had to prove a contradiction symbol because what I was doing was reductio there. That's how the plan was proceeding. And how do I get that contradiction symbol? This is so similar to what we did before. We have to build the premise 1 from the inside. The only difference is the inside is slightly different now. So the structure of this thing is now mirroring my new insides on line 1. That's why there's an arrow here suddenly. Because only if this has the arrow now is it going to properly contradict my original premise. And how am I going to get that? Well, I'm going to have to get that by existential intro again. So that rule is even the same. But the thing that I do the existential intro on is slightly different. It's got to be the wide scope arrow instead of that wide scope disjunction. So once you see your way to these differences, this minor difference that shows up here, P of n arrow Q of n, this tells me why I'm assuming P of n on line 4, because this is how we prove an arrow. We got to do an arrow intro proof. We have to assume the antecedent and try to get to the consequent. So I assume P of n on line 4, and I know already that I'm trying to get to Q of n. Looking into the future and seeing how each of these subproofs is going to end is essential to figuring out what you might do next. Now, how am I going to prove Q of n out of thin air? Because Q of n doesn't appear up here on these other lines. Well, remember the contradiction trick. Remember that I know P of n and not P of n. So that's a contradiction symbol. And that allows me to do contradiction elim. That allows me to prove anything I want. Why do I want Q of n? Because I know I need this arrow claim, P of n arrow Q of n, in order to eventually get the thing that's going to contradict line 1. So that allows me to justify line 7 with arrow intro. That allows me to justify line 8 with existential intro. Notice the rule is the same. It's only the insides of that existential that are different between this and the previous proof. And all of these rules are going to be the same now from now on out. Contradiction intro is how line 9 works. Negation intro is how I finished off that earlier subproof. And then finally, universal intro is what I did with the subproof starting on line 2 when I assumed n was an arbitrary name, because that's how the rule for universal intro works. So hopefully the comparison from this and the previous proof lets you see that when you have these wide scope quantifiers, like my universal conclusion, that sets up this kind of structure for the proof as a whole. And any of those minor differences from the inside parts don't yet impact that. Only later on, downstream from that, am I going to get a difference. And you see exactly in this proof where those differences become apparent. Okay, thanks.